Story 1. In ancient China, there was a man named Liu Bang who served as a provincial constable, essentially a sheriff. One day he was transporting prisoners when they escaped. At the time, the Qin dynasty ruled that the punishment for allowing prisoners to escape was death. Liu Bang thought, in for a penny, in for a pound, and joined his former prisoners. He became a warlord and eventually overthrew the Qin dynasty, establishing himself as the first emperor of the Han dynasty, which would rule for over 400 years until the famous Three Kingdoms period in 220 Anno Domini. It was quite the escalation, caused by harsh consequences for a relatively petty mistake. Story 2. Hurricane Katrina. The storm barely affected New Orleans. Then the levees broke. Story 3. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire began when a governor massacred a Mongol trade caravan, and the Shah executed one of the Mongol envoys who had demanded proper compensation for the incident. Story 4. The fall of the inner German border. It was announced on the evening of November 9, 1989 by Politburo member Gunter Schabowski at a somewhat chaotic press conference in East Berlin. The new border control regime was presented as a means of relieving people of psychological pressure by legalizing and simplifying migration. Schabowski had been given a note with handwritten annotations but without the crucial information: the date when these rules would take effect. That date had been communicated only verbally among Politburo members at their most recent meetings, which Schabowski had not attended. In response to a press question about when the new travel rules would take effect, Schabowski read the note. When asked again about the date, he rechecked the document, found no date, and replied, slightly irritated, "As far as I know, it is effective immediately without delay," rather than saying it would begin the following day as intended. In short, the speaker at the press conference improvised, and people immediately began lining up to leave. Story 5. United States ship Wisconsin versus a North Korean artillery battery. Korean War, 1952. A North Korean artillery battery made the ill-advised decision to open fire on the United States ship Wisconsin. A single 155mm shell caused minor damage and injured 3 sailors. The Wisconsin immediately brought all 9 of its 16-inch deck guns to bear and opened fire with a full broadside. The artillery battery was destroyed, and the hill on which it stood was obliterated. One of the Wisconsin escort ships sent a 2-word message after the smoke cleared: "Temper, temper." Story 6. The outbreak of World War I occurred a few weeks after a man and his wife were shot. Story 7. I said, "Dinner is ready." Then my toddler threw himself to the floor and yelled, "But I want to have lunch." He proceeded to scream at the top of his lungs and roll around. Not historical, but the fastest I have witnessed personally. Story 8. George Bush doesn't care about black people, Kanye West said. That was the visual definition of 0 to 100. Story 9. A woman said her car stopped because it ran out of gas. A homeless man gave her his last $20 to help her get home. A television segment portrayed it as a feel-good story and a GoFundMe campaign was set up, but greed caused the story to unravel. It turned out to be a scam. The 3 perpetrators were in on it together. Story 10. The Great Molasses Flood. 1 second everything was fine. The next, everyone was in a very sticky situation. Story 11. Not the most but still pretty wild. The Korean axe murder incident, also known as the Panmunjom axe atrocity incident, was the killing of 2 United Nations command officers, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett, by North Korean soldiers on August 18, 1976, in the Joint Security Area in the Korean Demilitarized Zone. The officers, from the United States Army, had been part of a work party cutting down a poplar tree in the Joint Security Area. In response to the incident, the United Nations Command determined that instead of trimming the branches that obscured visibility, they would cut down the tree with the aid of overwhelming force. The parameters of the operation were decided in the White House, where United States President Gerald Ford held crisis talks. Ford and his advisors were concerned about making a show of strength to chasten North Korea without causing further escalation. The operation, named after the mythical lumberjack Paul Bunyan, was conceived as a show of force by the United States and South Korea and was carefully managed to prevent further escalation. It was planned over 2 days by General Richard G. Stilwell and his staff at the United Nations Command Headquarters in Seoul. Operation Paul Bunyan was carried out on August 21st at 7 o'clock, 3 days after the killings. A convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles, Task Force Vieira, named after Lieutenant Colonel Victor S. Vieira, commander of the United States Army Support Group, drove into the joint security area without warning to the North Koreans, who had one observation post staffed at that hour. In the vehicles were two 8-man teams of military engineers from the 2nd Engineer Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division, equipped with chainsaws to cut down the tree. The teams were accompanied by two 30-man security platoons from the Joint Security Force, who were armed with pistols and axe handles. The first platoon secured the northern entrance to the joint security area via the Bridge of No Return, while the second platoon secured the southern edge of the area. Concurrently, a team from B Company, commanded by Captain Walter Seafried, had activated the detonation systems for the charges on Freedom Bridge and had the 165mm main gun of the M728 combat engineer vehicle aimed midspan to ensure that the bridge would fall if the order was given for its destruction. Also, B Company, supporting E Company responsible for the bridge, were building M4T6 rafts on the Imjin River in case the situation required emergency evacuation by that route. In addition, a 64-man task force of the Republic of Korea Army 1st Special Forces Brigade accompanied them, armed with clubs and trained in Taekwondo, initially without firearms. Once they parked their trucks near the Bridge of No Return, they began distributing M16 rifles and M79 grenade launchers that had been concealed under sandbags in the truck beds. Several of the commandos also had M18 Claymore mines strapped to their chests with the firing mechanisms in their hands, and they were shouting at the North Koreans to cross the bridge. The United States Infantry Company in 20 utility helicopters and 7 Cobra attack helicopters circled behind them. Behind these helicopters, B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers came from Guam escorted by United States F-4 Phantom II aircraft from Kunsan Air Base. South Korean F-5 and F-86 fighters were visible at high altitude. F-4E Phantoms from Osan Air Base and Taegu Air Base, F-111 bombers of the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing out of Mountain Home Air Force Base, and F-4C and F-4D Phantoms from the 18th Tactical Fighter Wing based at Kadena Air Base and Clark Air Base were also deployed. The aircraft carrier United States ship Midway and its task force were moved to a station just offshore. Near the edges of the Korean demilitarized zone, many more heavily armed United States and South Korean infantry artillery, including the 2nd Battalion, 71st Air Defense Regiment armed with improved Hawk missiles and armor were waiting to back up the Special Operations Team. Bases near the Korean demilitarized zone were prepared for demolition in case of a military response. The defense readiness condition was elevated on the order of General Stilwell, as later recounted in Colonel de la Tour's research paper. In addition, 12,000 additional troops were ordered to Korea, including 1,800 Marines from Okinawa. During the operation, nuclear-capable strategic bombers circled over the joint security area. Story 12. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the United States rapidly moved from normal peacetime conditions to a situation in which nuclear war with the Soviet Union might happen at any moment. Story 13. Jack Ruby wired money to a topless dancer at the Dallas Western Union office on a Sunday morning in 1963. The $25 advance to Little Lynn, Karen Lynn Bennett, was so she could pay her bills. Ruby had just shut down the Carousel Club out of respect for the president's death 2 days earlier, so she had missed work on Friday and Saturday night. His receipt was stamped at 11:17 in the morning Central Standard Time. Then, as Time magazine reported on March 13, 1964, Ruby walked 339 feet 6 inches down the street to the underground garage ramp of police headquarters, and at precisely 11:21 in the morning he stepped out of a crowd of newsmen, shoved a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver at Lee Harvey Oswald and pulled the trigger. "I hope the son of a bitch dies. I hope I killed the son of a bitch. You know me, I'm Jack Ruby." Ruby allegedly left his Dachshund Shiba in the car. He also left a bag of money locked in the trunk. Ruby's murder of Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated was part of the most famous criminal case of the 20th century, if not in history, the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22, 1963. But a 4-minute turnaround from a financial transaction to infamy is one of the strangest I have ever heard. Story 14. Will Smith went from laughing at a joke to slapping Chris Rock in 3 seconds flat. That escalated faster than my internet bill after switching to unlimited data. Story 15. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which led to the end of the Cold War, was triggered when an East German official mistakenly announced that travel restrictions to the West would be lifted immediately. Crowds gathered at the wall, and border guards, overwhelmed and without clear orders, opened the gates, allowing people to cross freely for the first time in decades. One mistake by that official in the context of growing protests was all it took. Story 16. The Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. One safety test goes wrong, and within hours an entire region becomes uninhabitable for generations. That is not even escalation. That is a disaster unfolding at high speed. Story 17. The second plane on September 11th. At first it might have seemed like an accident or an isolated incident. Strange things happen. When the second plane hit the other tower, it became clear it was an attack and the world was about to change. Story 18. Henry VIII's entire reign can be summed up with a tale that escalated quickly, from his break with Rome to executing 2 wives and obtaining 2 annulments. The rhyme goes: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. He never actually divorced his wives. He had his marriages annulled. In his view, he was married twice, to Jane Seymour, who died, and to Catherine Parr, who outlived him. He also annulled the marriages of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard before having them executed. Story 19. In 1975, a San Diego news station brawl began as a turf dispute between Channel 4 and rival stations and ended with a man killed by a trident. Story 20. The assassination of Enrique Kiki Camarena by a Mexican drug cartel effectively started the modern war on drugs. Story 21. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II. Story 22. A very recent meeting. President Trump and Vice President Vance met with President Zelensky of Ukraine in the White House Oval Office. The meeting went from pleasantries to a full-scale shouting match. "You are playing with World War III." It lasted about 5 minutes. Story 23. The implosion of the Titan submersible during a deep-sea voyage to the Titanic wreckage, operated by OceanGate, occurred in 2023. Story 24. Sorrowfully, I have seen it described that the Wounded Knee massacre was sparked when a firearm discharged from a Lakota man with a hearing impairment while the weapon was being confiscated by a white soldier, among people who were already surrendering. Story 25. Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey was expected to stay offshore but made landfall. It caused severe damage across much of New Jersey from south to north and in parts of New York City. Story 26. I am surprised no one has mentioned the station nightclub fire. The manager for the band Great White set off 4 pyrotechnic devices, and within minutes more than 200 people were dead. Story 27. Trump comes down an escalator, calls Mexicans rapists, and says he is running for president. 10 years later, we are still dealing with it. Story 28. The only possible answer is the outbreak of World War I. I do not think it is even close. Story 29. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was followed, a few months later, by millions of deaths across Europe. Story 30. The War of Jenkins' Ear. The Spanish Coast Guard cut off a British captain's ear, possibly by accident. The incident helped trigger a war that lasted 9 years across several theaters of conflict, and about 35,000 people died. Story 31. The Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 world leaders literally played chicken with nuclear weapons. Humanity almost unlocked the game over ending in 13 days. Story 32. Charlie Kirk was asked about gun violence and was then strongly criticized. Story 33. I would say the war in the Pacific. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 4 years later, on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and 3 days later another on Nagasaki, after Japan had not yet surrendered. Story 34. The attempted and mostly botched funeral of William the Conqueror read like a Monty Python skit in how absurd and oddly comical it was. Story 35. One morning in 1980, about 0.67 cubic miles of rock slid down the side of Mount St. Helens, and the eruption escalated quickly from there. Story 36. Franz Ferdinand gets shot, some alliances get cranky, and suddenly half the planet is in trenches while the other half argues over who started it. 0 to World War in about 37 days. That is not escalation. That is the historical equivalent of dropping a Mentos into the world's Coca-Cola bottle. Story 37. I feel like that moment in the 1789 French Revolution when they began executing those who had started it, such as Robespierre. I was laughing out loud. It happened so quickly. Story 38. Trump's winning the presidency in 2025 happened very quickly. Story 39. The French Revolution. People went from being hungry to deciding to remove the king's head very quickly. Story 40. When the Sultan's emissaries went to demand tribute from Vladimir Tepich, they refused to remove their hats as a sign of respect. Vladimir ordered their hats nailed to their heads. Story 41. Mohammad Bouazizi died by self-immolation in late 2010, sparking the Arab Spring protests and contributing to the later conflicts in Syria and Yemen. Story 42. When 2020 went from 2-week quarantine to laughing out loud, never mind. Story 43. The Boston Tea Party. British. It's just a little tax. Colonists. Throw the entire shipment into the ocean. Story 44. Vesuvius erupted very quickly. Perhaps the dinosaur asteroid almost ended life on Earth. Story 45. A spokesperson did not read the notes properly about increased freedom to travel for East Berliners and announced open borders. The Berlin Wall began to come down a few hours later. Story 46. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was the catalyst for millions of pointless deaths among competing empires. Story 47. Adolf Hitler was rejected from art school. Years later, during World War II, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Story 48. Do you remember that guy who, 20 years ago, everyone who knew him would have agreed was a crook, cheat, scam artist, and child abuser? He has been president of the United States twice. If there is one thing people love, it is being a sucker. Story 49. When people murdered Mongol ambassadors, it usually ended with the Mongols erasing entire nations in retaliation for killing their envoys. Story 50. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 is probably the most that escalated quickly moment in history. Story 51. Artificial intelligence has, in the last 10 years, gone from pet robot dogs that needed batteries to move to fully automated robot waiters, robot assistants on phones, and the marvel that is chat generative pre-trained transformer. Many of these technologies have become self-aware and passed the Turing test. Artificial intelligence has evolved millions of times faster than we have, and it is still growing. Story 52. The Big Bang produced many of the problems we are still dealing with today. Story 53. Probably the American Civil War. All right. Well, this one state flipped out about the election result and claims it left the country, although it is in the middle of the country. I guess, what on earth? About 11 other states have left too. And they are shooting at our forts? Story 54. Crap. I thought I was commenting on a different post, and now I cannot figure out how to erase it, but I can change it if it has some text in it. So here you go, folks. Some text. Nothing to see here. Story 55. A man was shot in a road rage incident and Germany, France, Great Britain, and Russia went to war over it. Eventually, the United States joined in too. Story 56. Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Story 57. Relative to geological time, it is the first moment a great ape somewhere in Africa stood up and walked on 2 legs. Story 58. This was the start of the Second Opium War. Chinese officials took down the Union Jack on a Chinese-owned, Chinese-manned ship that had paid to fly it. Violence escalated, and many Chinese were massacred. Story 59. Extinction of the dinosaurs. Even though it took many years for species to disappear and birds survived, a massive meteor striking the Earth clearly counts as an escalation. Story 60. I do not know if it will be the most in history, But we are about to see a rapidly escalating movement any day now. Later, people will ask those of us who are present if it is true that the entire grand old party turned its back on the man in a matter of weeks. Story 61. The microwave truly changed meal preparation, turning hours into minutes. It is the ultimate solution for quick meals. What is your go-to? Story 62. Thinking that an island nation like Japan could conquer China and the United States. Story 63. The moment someone said, "It's just a small problem," the whole project was suddenly on fire. Story 64. The emergence of the Rashidun Caliphate caught both the Romans and the Persians off guard. Story 65. History is a highlight reel of people fast-forwarding to disaster. Half the biggest shifts happened because someone messed up paperwork or ignored warnings. Story 66. Honestly, history is full of them, but the start of World War I hits hard. Story 67. Pompeii. People were going about their day and then boom, Vesuvius erupted unexpectedly. There was no buildup, just immediate chaos. Story 68. Some of the fastest escalations in history are not wars or politics but nature itself. There are floods where water rises from ankle-deep to levels that destroy entire farming communities within hours. People go to sleep thinking the rain is manageable, and by morning their crops, animals, and livelihoods are gone. It is terrifying how quickly everything is fine can turn into we have nothing left. Story 69. The French Revolution always blows my mind. People went from being kind of upset to heads rolling in record time. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.